times of going twice.
So, Mr. Walt Simonson, you're a fan of Walt Disney, specifically Carl Barks. Can you tell us about what this is? And this is actually your art, isn't it?
It is my art. It was a print. It's a print of a drawing I did probably about 1974. I have a close friend, Kim Weston. Kim is possibly the biggest Carl Barks fan in the entire world. And in the old days, there were things called APAs, which were amateur press associations. And if this is before the internet, I know some of you won't believe that, and it's before xerography. So what would happen is fans who liked stuff, like comics, they would, or science fiction, there were a lot of different APAs, every subject you could imagine. And what you would do, if you remember the APA, you would write your contribution. You'd write one usually every 3 or 4 months, quarterly, by month, or whatever it was. And you would print up, it'd be about 4 pages, 2 to 4 pages long. You would mimeograph it or ditto it. Look those up on Wikipedia, and staple your contribution together. You'd print up about however many copies there were members of the APA. If you had 20 guys in the APA, you'd print up 20 copies. 40 guys, 40 copies. You'd mail all your copies off to one of your members who was elected as a central compiler. He would take all the copies from everybody, and he would sort them out so that there was a pile of 1 copy of every contribution.
Wow.
So if there were 40 guys, he had 40 piles. He would staple them together, and he would mail them out to every member. And that way you would get a copy of everybody's contribution, including your own, but you got one from everybody. So Kim was a member of an APA. He was a big Carl Barks fan. He decided back then to do one of his issues where he was going to help people collect Carl Barks, but they couldn't afford the old stuff. Even back then, the older stuff was more expensive. However, Gold Key or Dell or Gold Key, whoever was putting the Walt Disney comics and stories back at that time, they would reprint Carl. They reprinted Carl Barks for years. And so and it would often say reprint or whatever, but maybe not always. So he put up a concordance. He printed up a concordance, the original issue and the reprint issue, which was way cheaper because it was much more recent. And so you could get a pretty decent collection of Carl Barks' work by looking through this concordance and finding those issues.
That's fascinating.
So that was really what he was doing. So he got a hold of me. We were friends at that time. We grew up in the same general area. And he asked me if I would do a page in the style of Carl Barks. It was a gag that he was going to write. I would draw it. I would draw it as if I were Carl Barks. Good luck to that. And
wow,
I did it the same size as Barks used to work, I think 2.5 times up. So we did this. It's in 2 sections. This is a print of, I gave Kim the artwork, so he has the art. So he's just recently published a book of most reproductions from first generation photostats of Barks' work, not the duck stuff, but work from the burrow and the bear and different characters that he did, other work at about the same time. And this is included, and you can see the yellow across the center. That's because this was done, it's large enough. It's done in 2 halves. Barks worked usually, I gather, in 2 halves, and then they were put together. So that's the old rubber cement stain is from where it was glued together and made to work. So this was the gag.
But you drew all that.
This is all my drawing. Kim wrote it, and basically it's the Donald and the nephews are going over to the money bin where Scrooge has, and because the money bin is now empty, he has spent every dime of the money bin. And when they get there, they can look down, they can see, and down here in the corner, that's because Uncle Scrooge spent all the money he had
so that was
and
filled with money.
He bought a complete collection of Carl Barks' work. So that's why it cost him every dime he had, and it was well worth it.
That's
so
great.
That was the gag, and this became the cover for the fanzine.
So you mentioned as a kid the only subscription you had was to Walt Disney comic books.
That's right, Walt Disney Comics and Stories. My parents were fine. I had a younger brother. They were fine with us reading comics. They wanted to just instill the habit of reading in us. Didn't care what we read. So we got copies of that for a long time. I would buy Uncle Scrooge. Uncle Scrooge at the time, it was quarterly. So I would buy that. We just find the newsstand and pick it up. But we read, as much Barks as we could. And we also, as people did back then, there were no credits. So Barks came to be known as the good duck man. And it wasn't the other cartoonists were awful. They weren't. But you could tell Carl Barks from any other duck artist. And he just did beautiful work. And a good storyteller, wonderful writer, one of my favorite guys ever to do comic books. in this country or any other country. So years later, when I was doing Thor, I keep notes on books I'm doing, and I had some notes, and it'll be notes on. I'll think of a plot. I'll be walking in a hotel like this, and it'd be kind of cool if this happened, and then I'll write that down, and I'll write down the notes. I'll go home and I'll add it to my notes, and so I'll have, usually by the time I'm done a book, I got more notes than I actually have stories. But you never know what's going to be useful. One of the notes I had in my Thor notes was "tip of the hat to Carl Barks." That's all it said. And I got to a point in my stories where I said, I could change Thor into a duck. And then I rethought, because of Carl Barks. But I rethought that, and I said, well, there's Donald Duck, there's Daffy Duck, there's Howard the Duck at Marvel. There are probably other ducks I'm forgetting. I'm sorry, other ducks. But, so I thought, in the fairy tales, handsome princes are usually turned into frogs. So I thought I would go for a frog. And it worked because one of Barks' stories in the Donald Duck series was the story of Catapult, who was a frog who was, in the story, by the time it's over, the greatest hero ever to visit Duckburg.
Wow, that's where Thor came from.
So that's where the idea for the Thor Frog came from.
Excellent.
So I did the Thor Frog as a story. I have to say, I have to use this, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I never expected it to have legs. And here we are, 40 years later, 35, 40 years later, and there are little frog toys and magnets that will sit on your shoulder. There are just, they've done a Throg. That was Chris Eliopoulos. He decided to take the Thor Frog idea I'd done, and he used one of the other frogs in my frog story, a human who'd been transformed to a frog, and he had him find a sliver of the hammer. The hammer became a tiny Mjolnir. He became Throg, a little frog. So I did not invent Throg, but Chris stood on my shoulders to invent him. So, but the Thor Frog idea really began as a tip of the hat to Carl Barks.
Thank you, sir.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it. What a wonderful story.
All right, you guys be well. Take care.
I wanted to take a minute to talk to Dan about a commission that I had him do at OAX in January. And I know I have a history with this piece, but I just wanted to take the opportunity to see what your take on this layout was and what it was like to revisit it.
Okay, so we should first explain what the layout was for, which was I had done a number of different cover sketches for Superman Omnibus, Death of Superman Omnibus. And in this case, I took an approach with the 4 replacement Superman, with Superman all silhouetted in black to symbolize the idea of death and him being gone and everything, yet still get that silhouette and that familiar S-shield on the cover. And that was the approach to this particular cover idea. DC chose to go in a different direction, which is absolutely fine. Whenever I do, 4, 5, or 6 different cover designs, I always know only one is going to survive, although sometimes 2 will, and we'll do them in back-to-back issues or whatever. But in this case, we ended up printing all the different ideas, I think, as part of a back feature or something like that.
In one of the books, I think it was, yes.
Yeah. And Carl saw this one, which was just a kind of a rough ink layout, and you take it from there.
Yeah, so it's a layout that I really loved. And when you talk about getting a commission or a piece done, I like to have things that have a history or maybe would have fit into a story at a time. But this definitely, it already had a history. Dan had done the layout and it was there. And the layout just spoke to me. And when we actually talked about revisiting it, you had said, did I want the Superman to be shadowed out like he is here? And I said, absolutely. That is a big part of what makes this Death and Return piece work, and also the fact that it's the replacement's kind of operating in his shadow, so it just thematically worked. And then actually you added in the tattered cape flag, which is a nice touch.
Thanks. And that's exactly it. As I was drawing it up, it was the one thing that occurred to me that I should have added in the first place. But so I said, okay, now I can make up for that. And honestly, that's what often happens, is I will have the cover idea in terms of the sketch or whatever, but as I finalize it, and end up adding something like that or taking something away that is just too obtrusive. In this case, it fit just fine and helped to add to that idea of Superman being gone, and here these guys are.
Perfect. Just one last thing. So, and I think of this is right in my ripe, I was 12, 13, 14. This just spoke to me, captured my imagination. Now, just real quickly, I know you've been asked this probably before, but that time was wild for you and busy and crazy. But what's one thing that you can kind of, what's the one thing that kind of sticks out when you think about that era of?
Really, it is the overall sense of the craziness, just because it was every day something different happened. And this was really very much pre-internet. And almost every single day there was a phone call, and it started out with, "You won't believe this, but," and it would be such and such is licensing this for a product and we have to do trading cards, or this happened and because of that we have this problem. I mean, it was that way all the time, and it was often getting more Death of Superman related product out there some way, somehow. And really, because that's what sticks with me, because that will never happen again. There won't ever be anything like that in comics. I also want to say that in terms of getting this done as a commission, I penciled it, but Brett Breeding inked
Absolutely.
it. Brett did a brilliant job on the inks on this. So
Now,
I just want to make sure we're clear on that.
That was something we talked about as well when
Yes.
we were at the show. That's why it's signed in pencil, because I saw the pencils and I immediately fell in love with them.
Yeah.
Instinctively, I wanted to have Brett ink it, but then I was debating, do I preserve the pencils? But I have a scan, and then the answer was the correct answer, to have Brett treat this. Finish it off properly. So, well, Dan, thank you so much for doing this. I hope
Awesome.
you have a great show. So.
Glad you like it.
Thanks.
Thank you, Carl.
Take care.